talking about the Hebrew Israelites that are coming up to the truth of their heritage and realize this is their book. This is written about their family. You can easily see it from beginning to end that this is about one people. One people.
The decline of the Jewish communities of West Africa Maghreb most likely began with the influx of Arab invaders into North Africa starting in 640 CE and later into West Africa in the 1300s and 1400 CE. So after you had established communities and empires on the north and west parts of Africa, after the 7th centuries, that's when Muhammad and his band of thugs came down there on the north parts of Africa with the Quran in one hand and the sword in another one. And they were forcibly converting the Israelite into that nonsense Islam. Because that's not what we're dealing with. That's the Arabs' religion. And that was the beginning and the forefront of the Arab slave trade.
So the Arabs, brought Mohammedanism or Islam into North Africa, of which the Moors, the Moabites, the Amorites, the Canaanites embraced, and they recognized it as their religion. So these people, the Canaanites, the Amorites, all these people, took Mohammedanism, Islam as their ancient, their revived ancient religion, so they embraced it. So the Hebrew Israelites, those who believed in, the Torah, the law of Moses, all those things. So, or now at this time, they are called, Niger Congo Negroes. So the Hebrew Israelites, called the Niger Congo Negroes, or or Black Jews or Negro Jews, fought against Mohammedanism. It was called Mohammedanism back then. So we now call it, Islam. So they fought against Islam and the Moors. So we had this contention. We always fought with, we have, a back and forth, fight with the Moors and all that. So the Niger Congo Negroes, constantly boasted about being Abraham's seed or descendant. So we this is what they constantly like to do. Even back then, they like to, say we are of Abraham's seed, something like they took pride in. They boasted about it, about being Abraham's seed or descendants, like it meant something to them. It was very important to them. So the Arab Muslims or Mohammedans, as they were called back then, they called the Israelites or the Niger Congo people, Negroes, they called them Kafirs or Kafirs, meaning lawless, So because they refused to follow the new laws their Prophet Muhammad gave, though the Israelites followed the Torah mixed with Egyptian and Canaanite concept. So, at this time, at this point, the Israelites, the Negro Jews, had, they followed the Torah, but it was also mixed with some Egyptian and Canaanite concept. And these Arabs, Arab Muslims, Mohammedans called us, Kafirs or Kafirs, meaning lawlessness, and because we refused to follow, what Prophet Muhammad gave to them. We refused to follow their ancient, religion, their revived ancient religion. They refused to follow that ancient religion, and they boasted about, being Abraham's, seed or descendants. So the Arabs took the Israelite, Niger Congo Negroes, they took the Israelite and sold them as slaves to other nations. This was called the Sub-Saharan slave trade or the Islamic slave trade. So you can look at what is an Islamic slave trade or the Sub-Saharan slave trade. That's where the Arabs took us, our ancestors, as slaves, because we refused. We fought against this ancient religion of the Canaanites and all that, which was revived, and called Islam.
Early Arab rulers such as Uqba bin Nafi would impose a tribute of 360 slaves on whatever region he controlled. This tradition of course continued to develop and rapidly expanded into a much larger demand. To keep up with this demand, slaves had to be taken from further south, places like Mali, Senegal, Chad, and even northern Nigeria. After slavery was firmly established and very profitable, it became a sort of free-for-all for the Arab Berber Muslims. Large numbers of Africans were sent north, generally to serve as domestic servants or slave concubines. It's been estimated that from the 10th to the 19th century, some 6,000 to 7,000 slaves were transported north each year. The journey across the desert was of course absolutely brutal, and many Africans perished along the way. According to Henry Hamilton Johnston, who was a British explorer, he claims in his book that many slaves would be able to just reach the drinking place and then would sink down and die before the water reached their lips. These traders captured Bantu peoples largely from the interior of present-day Kenya, Mozambique, and Tanzania. Large slave markets developed in Zanzibar and Pemba, where at the height of the trade, as many as 15,000 to 20,000 slaves passed through annually. The slave trade became so significant that in 1840 the Sultan of Oman moved his seat of power to Zanzibar. The Arab slave trade was absolutely devastating to African people. It was a trauma akin to the Atlantic slave trade. All the horrors of the Atlantic slave trade can be found in the Arab slave trade. For whatever reason, the Atlantic slave trade is simply more popular. Some historians assert that as many as 17 million people were sold into slavery on the coast of the Indian Ocean, the Middle East, and North Africa, and approximately 5 million enslaved Africans were transported by Muslim slave traders via the Red Sea, Indian Ocean, and Sahara Desert to other parts of the world between 1500 and 1900.
The Negro presence and contributions while living amongst Hamitic nations as Egypt, Mitzrayim, and Ethiopia, which is Cush, is important to understand the greater diaspora of Israelite communities. The records of the Hebrew Israelites in the Bible say that the Israelites would be scattered throughout the four corners of the world. Most of the Negroes in the Western Hemisphere are only familiar with the West and the Transatlantic slave trade, but not many people are familiar with the East African slave trade. Understanding that the Negroes equal Bantus equal the Israelites is a critical point to realize because it connects us to the mysteries of the East. Just as we are familiar with the West African Negro land, that the Americaribo Negroes are descended from, we must also become familiar with the East Africans Negro land. The East African Negro land, also known as Zanj, which means land of the Negroes in Arabic. Zanj is populated by Bantu people as well, of course, therefore making them Israelites as well. The histories of the Bantu Israelites of the East African Zanj will lead us to many connections between the Bantu Israelites and the Far East. Again, the understanding that the Niger-Congo equal Bantu Zanji equal Negroes equal Israelites is imperative to understand the origins of many mysteries of the Far East so that we might have a better eye to see Israelites in all four corners of their dispersion and trace them throughout history. Israelites migrate from ancient Israel into East Africa Zanji areas. The East African Zanji were mainly enslaved by the Arabs. Let me say that one more time. The East African Zanji, which were Bantus / Negroes / Israelites, who were mainly enslaved by the Arabs, were sent to places like India, Java, and China as servants. But prior to the period of slavery, the Zanji traveled to the same lands as merchants, mercenaries, farmers, and among many other professions. In fact, history seems to demonstrate that the Bantu Israelites, through civilizations from the African continent and the Near East, introduced it to the Far East. When I say civilization, I mean things such as advanced iron smelting techniques and agricultural practices, rice terraces, herbology, and the foundations of Davidian and Chinese traditional medicine, irrigation and architecture, and more. This is a what you call an Arabic manuscript portraying Zanji merchants on an Mtipe ship, and Zanji is Arabic for the Bantus, the Israelites, essentially. Okay. In order to make further distinction between the Shemitic Negro and the Hamitic African, let's return back to the Zondervan Compact Bible Dictionary definition of Ham. The definition states, just so I'm clear, the Zondervan Compact Bible Dictionary is basically just it's Genesis 10 and 6, but like I always say, it threw us a caveat. Genesis 10 and 6 gives us the descendants of Ham, or the children of Ham. The Zondervan Compact Bible Dictionary tells us that, plus it threw in that he did become the progenitor of those races, but not the Negroes. All right, I just want to say that real quick. The definition states that Ham was the progenitor of the dark races, not the Negroes, but the Egyptians, Ethiopians, Libyans, and Canaanites. The ethnographic world map below, found a 1932 German encyclopedia, provides great visual support to the Zondervan's definition of Ham. The map makes a clear distinction in Africa between the Hamites and the Sudan Bantu Negroes. Both the Sudan and Bantu Niger, or Sub-Saharan Negro, fall under the Negroid Rasi, or Negro race classification. It is also interesting to note that the Pseudo-Bantu Negroes are on the map highlights the same areas that are identified as areas of the Niger, Congo, and Bantu peoples, whom are Israelites. Thus, it becomes a further intrigue if we understand that the Hamite is not the Negro and that the Negro is the Israelite, that on this particular map under the Negro race classification, we can find other racial groups outside of Africa that are also classified and related to the Negro race. Groups such as Hottentot, Melanesia, Negrito, Austria, and the Dravida are all listed as part of the Negro race and are strongly connected with East African trade routes and the Zanji Bantu Israelites. This map helps to demonstrate the connection between the Zanji/Bantu, all the various places along the eastern trade routes. Sub-Saharan Africa is the region of the continent with the highest population density by Negroes, non-Hamitic Africans. These Negroes have also been identified as Israelites. The research of scholars corroborates the biblical records of the Hebrew Israelites, which also states that Sub-Saharan Africa would be an area inhabited by the Israelites.
So our people were sold up to Europe, Egypt, Arabia, Persia, India, to China, as well as Japan. You see. So this was basically the scattering. This was the fulfillment of that scripture where the Messiah said that we shall fall by the edge of the sword and shall be led away captive into all nations. You understand? So this was basically that. This was basically being led away captive, as you can see. So we got to India, to China. So now you see, this is how we lost our identity. So those who went to Arabia, they became Arabians. Now they are not Israelites anymore. Persia, India, now they're Indians. They ended up worshipping Buddha. No, not Buddha, worshipping Hindu, Krishna, and whatever. Those who ended up in China ended up worshipping Buddha, Taoism. You see, so this is how, when he said that he shall scatter us into all nations, and wherever he shall scatter us, we shall worship other gods, other mighty ones, which our forefathers have never known, even wood and stone. So these are idols. So our people eventually ended up worshiping idols. So this is how our people were taken from Somalia, from Zanzibar, from West Africa. Even as you can see from here, they were also sold in Northern Africa, in Morocco, places you see Algeria, Tunisia, and many more. Yeah, so this is the Arab slave trade. So now let's go to the transatlantic slave trade. So before that, we show that our people migrated most in West Africa. So as you can see on this map, this is a map that shows you the Jewish settlements from these places, Rio de Oro, Mauritania, usually the Sahara Desert. I showed you in those migration map how our people, the Israelites, were full in this thing, in this West Africa. But when the Arabs came, the started. What is this? The communities in decline. You understand? So this led to the transatlantic slave trade.
This quote is from the Nautical Magazine, a journal of papers connected to maritime affairs by Brown and Ferguson, 1870. Gonzalez was the first Portuguese in 1442 who returned with Negro slaves, purchased instead of the Africans. Hold up. Let's read that again. Gonzalez was the first Portuguese in 1442 who returned with Negro slaves purchased instead of the Africans? Wait, so this Portuguese slave trader was selling Negroes that are not African? But I thought the Negroes were Africans. Well, funny story about the word Negro. See, when people think Negro, they think African. But the word Negro wasn't defined as a person from Africa until the year 1550. Negro, 1550s. Member of a black-skinned race from Africa. From Portuguese and Spanish, Negro, black. First use of the noun Negro, 1555. So the term Negro wasn't used as a definition of people from Africa or of African descent to the year 1555. So what the heck were we before 1555? Quote, in Portugal, the name of a Jew is a term of such high reproach that the government found it necessary to enact a law which forbade any person to call another person by that appellation. If a man who styled a Jew to his face stabs the offender, the law does not even condemn him. And trifling as this regulation may appear, it's produced beneficial effects. The history of the Jews, from the destruction of Jerusalem to the present, by Hannah Adams, 1818. So there was a law passed in Portugal that Jews could not be called Jews any longer without illegal action. It was so extreme that if someone called you a Jew, you could stab them in the face and see no jail time. So then if the term Jew was outlawed, what were they called back then? Let's go back to the Nautical Magazine. Prince Harry's colonies were enlarged by his successors. King John II, in 1492, expelled all the Jews to the island of St. Thomas, which had been discovered in 1471, and to other Portuguese settlements on the continent of Africa. And from these banished Jews, the Black Portuguese, as they are called, and the Jews in Luango, who are despised even by the very Negroes, are descended. By these colonialists, St. Thomas soon became a considerable place of trade and valuable for its sugar plantations. These Negroes were purchased in Guinea, Congo, and Mansa Congo. Alright, hold on. You mean to tell me that in 1492, more happened than Columbus sailing the ocean blue?
Turn back, Columbus. Turn back, Columbus.
And that the Jews of Spain and Portugal, who were known as the Negroes, were sent from Spain and Portugal to slave colonies to be sold to work on sugar plantations, all at the same time. And that these were the same outposts that were used in the transatlantic slave trade. So how did that get left out? Well, let's get a little more specific. The King of Portugal lent a colony thither, above 200 years before, whom the unwholesome air destroyed. Yet the place was not left desolate, for he sent new inhabitants, who first settled Guinea, next in Angola, and lastly on St. Thomas, that they may also be better used to the air. That the said king sold all those Jews for slaves that refused to embrace the Roman religion, and caused their children to be baptized, from whom coming together in great numbers, most of the present inhabitants were descended. America, being the latest and most accurate description of the New World, containing the original inhabitants of their remarkable voyages thither, by John Ogilvy, 1671. See, when it comes to the history of our people, very few know and understand how this all started. How did our slavery begin? Why were we called Negroes and not Africans? And why are people allegedly African and sold to the British will have a Portuguese name? How did we become Christians? The origin of it all starts with the church. A curious circumstance was, however, omitted. When the Portuguese first began to traffic Negroes, an application was made to the Pope to sanctify the trade by a bull, which His Holiness issued accordingly. In consequence of this permission and authority, a very considerable slave market was established and lives in Portugal, insomuch that the year 1539, from 10 to 12,000 Negroes was sold there annually. A historical survey of the island of St. Domingo, together with the account of Maroon Negroes by Sir William Young, 1794. See, the term Negro was birthed in Portugal. Even the first slaves to be sold in the transatlantic slave trade never touched the continent of Africa. I'm gonna say that again, so you can understand or possibly didn't hear. The first slaves to be sold in the transatlantic slave trade never saw the continent of Africa. See, by law, the only slaves that could be brought to the Americas were Negroes born in Spain and Portugal, brought directly from Spain and Portugal to the colonies. But later, a charter granted by Emperor Charles to Lorenzo de Gondomar gave permission to transport Spanish Negroes directly from Africa to the Spanish-American colonies. He circumvented the legal statute established by Ferdinand and Isabella that slaves must have been born in Spain by allowing Africans to enter the Americas, provided they quote-unquote convert during the voyage. I know for some this might be hard to swallow, so let me paint the full picture for you. There was a people who lived in Spain and Portugal who were called the Negroes. These Negroes claimed to be the remnants of the Yahudim, or the Jews, left after Nebuchadnezzar took the Judeans captive. Every historian attested that not only were they black, but according to writers like J.A. Rogers, so dark were the Jews, especially of Portugal and southern Spain that many whites thought all Jews were black. And sometimes the writers would use the word swarthy, which means black. For instance, 'tis also a vulgar error. He wrote that the Jews were all black, but this is only true of the Portuguese, who marrying always one another beget children like themselves, and consequently the swarthiness of their complexion is entailed upon their whole race, even in northern regions. So some people like to take the word swarthy and say it doesn't mean black. Well, just for kicks, let's take a look at it. Swarthy, from the root word swart, Old English swart, black, dark, of night. Gothic swart, dark colored, black, from the Pi root swardo, dirty, dark, black. The true Germanic word, surviving the continental languages, but displaced in English by black. But let's get an older definition from another dictionary. Swarthy, see swart, being of a dark hue of dusky complexion, tawny in warm climates. The complexion of men is universally swarthy or black. The Moors, Spaniards, and Italians are more swarthy than the French, German, and English, black as the swarthy African. So let's continue. This is why, again, the Duchess of Brantes, who was the ambassador, a wife to the ambassador of Portugal, said, the Jew, the Negro, and the Portuguese can be seen in a single person. Why? Because they were a single person. And these Portuguese Negroes were known for things that might ring a bell to an African American. Number one, they were known for writing poetry set to music. But in their pure poverty and touching tenderness of the pathos, the Jewish poets of Spain not only excelled their Moorish rivals, but every poet before or since. Once more, Israel's sons and daughters took their harps of Judea from off the mourning willows in the songs of Zion. The Jews and Moors in Spain by Joseph Krossoff. Secondly, they were known for wearing black cloaks and hoodies. The Almohad ruler, Abu Yusuf Laqab, is said to have introduced at the end of his reign an innovation with regard to the sukkah, cloak-like garment of the Jews, because they were dressing like the Muslims, and even like the most notable of them. Therefore, Jews henceforth were required to dress in the fashion of the mourning Muslims, dark blue or black. And they were required to wear black cloaks and black caps. Jews, Visigoths, and Muslims in medieval Spain by Norman Roth. And we notice Jew cavaliers mounted on richly caparisoned horses, and mules in fine cloaks, cassocks, silk doublets, and closed hoods. The Jews of Spain and Portugal by E.H. Lindo. And this rare painting by the anonymous 16th century painter who recorded a scene of everyday life at the King's Fountain. In Lipson, you can see the Negro Portuguese Jews wearing the black cloaks and caps, while others still dress in the Moorish or Muslim habit. Thirdly, they were oppressed and lived in segregated communities called ghettos. We discussed several such cases in detail in Chapter 7, including that of the recognition of the part of Thapelo David, Portugal, as the former Jewish ghetto, or Juderia, of the town, where the Jews lived in peace until their forced conversion. Antagonistic Tolerance, Competitive Sharing of Religious Sites and Spaces by Robert M. Hayden. The Jewish Quarter, known as the Juderia. In Lipson, the chief city, there are several Judearias. In all of the cities, Jewish quarters existed. These Judearias were closed every evening when the bell sounded for prayer, and were guarded by two watchmen appointed by the king. any Jew found outside of the Judea area after the first 3 tollings of the bells will find 10 liveries, or according to the order of King Don Pedro, was whipped through the city, and in case of repetition of the offense, punished with the confiscation of property. Old European juries, Phillips and David. So these Negroes wrote spoken words set to music, while wearing black hoodies and living in ghettos. You just can't make this stuff up. And these ghettos were policed by the Moors and then the Visigoths, aka the white Portuguese. These communities were not only segregated, but also had sundown laws, as in the Jim Crow South. One famous ghetto was a place called Macambo in Lipson. The word Macambo is a Portuguese word, meaning refuge for fleeing slaves. Now, why would a ghetto be called a refuge for fleeing slaves? See, the Inquisition, or persecution of the Jews, started in Spain and later came to Portugal. When these persecutions started, the Negro Jews of Spain began to flee to Portugal for a city of refuge. The number of those that were thus banished from Spain was 400,000 Jews, according to Rupklin and others. Mariana says, "'Tis not easy to reduce them to any certain number. Most writers affirm there were 170,000 families that departed. Others say there were 800,000 persons, a prodigious number, almost exceeding belief. Some of them, who were a little more dilatory in gathering together their effects and would not turn Christian, were sold for slaves. The Jews, thus driven from Spain, fled, for the most part, into Portugal." The History of the Inquisition by Philip Lombard. About 100,000 entered Portugal. They were permitted to enter under the condition that they must pay the poll tax, with the understanding that they will be asked to leave the country within 8 months. And when the time expired, many Jews were stranded because the king did not provide enough ships in time. All the black Jews who were left behind were deprived of their freedom and sold into slavery. From Babylon to Timbuktu by Dr. Rudolph R. Windsor. So Macambo became a refuge for a time for those who escaped the Spanish Inquisition until the persecutions in Portugal began. Hence the name Macambo, refuge for a fleeing slave. But soon afterwards, things began to deteriorate. See, when people think Inquisition, they think Catholics versus Protestants. They don't think Negroes and Jews. But the Inquisition quickly became a war against Negroes by the Catholic Church. Something was happening to these Negroes in Macambo that really should sound all too familiar to a black American. They were called auto de fe's, meaning acts of faith. Auto de fe, from the Portuguese auto de fe, meaning act of faith. A ritual of public penance carried out between the 15th and 19th centuries of condemned heretics and apostates, or those who refused to convert to Christianity, imposed by the Spanish and Portuguese Inquisition as punishment and enforced by civil authorities through beatings, hangings, and its most extreme form of death, by burning. Now, if we pay close attention to this timeline, we might see that the 15th to the 19th centuries is the exact same timeline of the expulsion, enslavement, beatings, hangings, and burnings of the Negroes, which was done in the territories of the Inquisitions by the executors of the Inquisition under the guise of acts of faith. Remember, the slave trade started with papal decrees of the Holy Roman Empire. And when they made, you might ask, well, 1450 and 1493. 1493? But wait, in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. So just a year later, all this started? And within a decade, the auto de fe's and later slaveries began. Let's not forget that 50 years later in 1550, the definition of Negro was changed from Black Portuguese to Native African. Lastly, when the slave colonies were established in Guinea, West Africa, by the Portuguese, which were filled with the enslaved children of the Negro Jews of Spain and Portugal, the territory, which was previously known as the Western Sudan or Soyudan, now became known after the arrival of the enslaved Portuguese as Negro land, and the slave coast as the Kingdom of Judah. The Kingdom of Judah by the slave traders. I could speak on what they said about the inhabitants of Ouida, but I'd rather let them speak for themselves. This quote is from Press and Bulletin Magazine, language document from the Society of Geography. Ouida, Fida, Huida, Ouida, Judah or Judah is a ancient city frequented since the 16th century by Portuguese slave traders who gave it its name. Its inhabitants were said to be Judaic and were viewed as a remnant of the scattered tribes of Israel. And the smoking gun is that these appellations, Negro land and Kingdom of Judah, was actually given by the Portuguese slave traders. Now, let's take an even closer look at the auto da fés. The act was started by what is called the Procession of the Penitents. The process began at the doorway of the Inquisitor's Palace, located on the Plaza of Santo Domingo, and worked its way toward the Central Plaza. At the front of the procession, the Inquisitors marched with their crucifix, carrying torches, whose black veils symbolized that Christ was in mourning for the heretics. The prisoners were escorted and guarded by the inquisitorial militia. And each was accompanied by two familiars of the Inquisition. Those who were sentenced to receive the punishment of public flogging also had a knotted noose or a cord around their neck as a sign that they would receive lashes or go to the galleys, or eventually be hung and burned at the stake. The images that you're seeing on your screen is from the Procession of the Penitents that would have taken place on the Altar da Fé, reenacted yearly in Spain. And these other images are the Ku Klux Klan in America. Is this just a coincidence that the Auto da Fés were mostly executions of Negro Jews, and the Ku Klux Klan is an organization whose sole purpose is to execute the Negro and hate Jews? When we look closely at the Auto da Fés, we can see the lynching of Jesse Washington, Emmett Till, Rosewood, Tulsa, Oklahoma, Wilmington, North Carolina, the Red Summer of 1919, when murderous riots and the destruction of whole towns took place in Negro communities all over the country, which is eerily similar to the events that took place all over Portugal and ghettos in the 14th to the 16th century. The same persecutions that Negroes faced in Portugal at the hands of the inquisitors of the church was the same that Negroes faced by the hands of Christians in America, in the rural South, aka the Bible Belt. Reason being, the territories of the Inquisition were the same places designated for slave colonies, which were filled with the victims who were then eventually shipped to the New World. So the Inquisition's war against the Negroes shifted to the newly acquired plantations in West Africa, then eventually to the Americas. The Lipson Inquisition was erected by Cardinal Henry, Second Inquisitor General AD 1539, over which he appointed the first Inquisitor, John de Mello, who had been made the first Inquisitor ad Evora by Dedicus de Silvia. The same cardinal also fixed the Inquisition at Cumbria, Portugal, and placed in it two commissary inquisitors, viz. Friar Bernard of the Cross, a predicate bishop of St. Thomas. St. Thomas. The History of the Inquisition, Volume 1, by Philippus van Limburg, 1633. 1551. Jurisdiction of the Tribunal of Lipson is expanded to compass Portugal's Atlantic islands, Azores and Madeira, Angola, Brazil, Cape Verde, Guinea, and San Tome. Inquisition, The Reign of Fear by Toby Green. So let's look at this. The Jews of Spain and Portugal were called the Negro Portuguese, who were exiled to slave colonies made for them and converted to Christians by the church. So after their Christian conversion by death and torture, these Negro Portuguese Jews were shipped to the Americas on slave ships. Now, the most integral place that was designated as the realm of exile for slavery of the Jews by the Inquisition was the land of St. Thomas. So much so, they even labeled it Ilhas Predas, or the Isles of Destruction. Let's revisit the Libro Negro, the Black Book, page 299. And shall be sent to the galleys, and the female, she shall be exiled to the island of Principe, St. Thomas or Angola. Page 325. And you shall be sent to the galleys or exiled to St. Thomas or Angola. Page 293. And the woman shall suffer the same penalty of whipping and exile to the island of Principe, St. Thomas or Angola. Page 276. And the female shall be exiled for many years to the Brazils or Angola. Page 326. And if there be no lawful proof to convict them, they shall be put to torture. Persisting in denying it, they shall be exiled to where? St. Thomas, Angola, or Brazil. A narrative of persecution of bylaws of the Inquisition of Lipson, both ancient and modern, in volumes. So they were Christianized and enslaved in St. Thomas, Angola, and Guinea. Speaking of Portugal, do you remember Pocos dos Negros in the ghetto of Macambo that they called a Juderia, or a community of Jews that lied on the corner of Jew Street? Remember, Macambo means refuge for the fleeing slave. Well, after the Negro Portuguese Jews' conviction and expulsion from Portugal, they were brought to Africa, where they were no longer called Macambos, but Mavumbas, outlaws, bandits, convicts, but also Black Jews. Near the Congo and Gabon, in 1776, Black Jews called Uvambu, or even Mavumbu, or Mayomba, May or Mavumbu, lived on the coast of Luando by the river named Rio Muni. By 1847, David Livingstone discovered a group of educated blacks living in the interior, some 200 miles from the coast of Luando. These blacks were called the Jews of Angola. They were good merchants, learned easily, and had knowledge of the Portuguese law and history. The elephant is no longer one of the animals Luango. The coast people call themselves Bapopt, not Brahmas. The Chinchko, a tribe, the Mavambu or Uvambu, are known to the Europeans as Black Jews. The History and Description of Africa by Leo Africanus. It is stated that the Falasha are not the only Jews of the Negro race. Bastian speaks of the Negro Jews living on the Luango coast in Western Africa. They are called Mavumbu or Judeos. The Jews, A Study of Race and Environment, Maurice Fishburne. A part of the local trade is in the hand of the Mavumbas, whose pronounced Semitic type has earned them the Portuguese designation of Judeo-Negroes, or Black Jews, the earth and its inhabitants, the universal geography, by Elise Reculis. The Mavumbu term was not the only moniker that the Portuguese Jews received in West Africa, but the Portuguese branded themselves yet with another term, degradados. Degradados. In 1662, the Municipal Court of Luando, Angola, requested and received permission from the Crown to send all the degradados into the interior to serve their sentences. Angola under the Portuguese, Jacquard J. Bender. Exile, or degradado, was a terrible and feared punishment precisely for this reason. It separated the criminal or the worthy sinner from the social and economic lifelines of family. Convicts and orphans in the Portuguese Empire, 1550 to 1755. Timothy J. Coates. Remember, it was the Portuguese Jews that were separated from their family. Their children were taken and left on the coast of St. Thomas, Angola, Guinea, and Brazil. So what exactly is a degradado? Degradados in the Indies, West Indies, including Brazil, was not a penalty that was applied to common criminals, robbers, thieves, forgers, etc. The penalty of degradado was only applicable to crimes of a political nature in cases which the accused were the category of noble. Where the accused were the category of noble. Because for those who were not noble or belonged to the servile class, the punishment was much more cruel. Humanities Magazine of the University of Montevideo, issue 1. A degradado is a royal or noble blood. So where exactly were these nobles sent? When the person condemned for this crime is noble, or of such quality that it appears he ought not to undergo the punishment of whipping or the galleys, he shall be exiled to Angola, St. Thomas, or parts of Brazil. A narrative of the persecution, the bylaws of the Inquisition of Libsyn, both ancient and then modern, in 2 volumes. Hipólito José de Costa. So the royal Jews were sent to the same plantations as the commoners. Quote, in legal theory, the punishment of degradado may have been exclusively for the members of the nobility, yet in practice was clearly extended to all members of the Portuguese society. Foreigners were not able to be sent to the overseas colonies and were usually simply banished from Portugal. Convicts and orphans in the Portuguese Empire, 1150 to 1755, by Timothy J. Coates. So this is serious. The royal class, the tribe of Judah, or Jews, or Yahudim, were exiled and sold in the same slave markets along with the other families of Judah. Well, the thing is, the entire tribe of Judah, or Yahudah, is the ruling class amongst the 12 tribes of Israel. So, the ruling class amongst the ruling class, aka the rulers amongst the tribe of Judah, is none other than the descendants of King David.
In later centuries, Jews are believed to have settled in Western Africa during the height of the Shanghai, Mali, Ghana, and Kenan-Borno Empire. According to accounts from explorers of the region, several powerful Jewish families of the Shanghai Empire were of Jewish origin. Some accounts place West African Jewish communities in the Hondu forest of Dahomey, south of Timbuktu. In the 1930s, these groups still maintain a Torah scroll written in Aramaic that had been burnt into parchment with a hot iron instead of ink, so it could not be changed. The black Jews had an advantage over the African tribes. They carried their culture, history, laws, and written records with them. This assured them a constant precedent for the development of a higher social organization. Because of the stability of the black Jewish culture, the Jewish were not absorbed into the autochthonous population. In fact, the Jews absorbed some of the native tribes. The Jews made use of every opportunity. They were an industrious and a skillful people. In the Jewish Ghanaian state were found kings, princes, governors, generals, secretaries, treasurers, revenue agents, judges, architects, engineers, doctors, historians, language interpreters, mathematicians, jewelers, sculptors, masons, carpenters, painters of art, goldsmiths, leather workers, potters, armorers, saddlers, blacksmiths, agriculturists, etc. So when we got into the land of Africa, the indigenous people of Africa were already there in the land, but eventually we managed to put these people, we pushed them to the shadow of the land, and we took over because we had a powerful social organization that was stronger than these people's. So, and because we were more skillful than them, we somehow managed to take over the land, which is why today you see Black Africa is actually occupied mostly by the Bantu nation. They're all over the place. The Black Africa is mostly occupied by the Bantu nation, which are the Israelite.
Deuteronomy 28, Deuteronomy 28 verse 68. And Yahuah shall bring you into Mitzrayim, Egypt again with ships. And the way of which I said to you, you shall see it no more again. And there you shall be sold to your enemies for slaves and female slaves, and no man shall buy you. And that is what happened to the regal class of the house of Judah. And I want to give you a brief history. I won't go into it too much, but I can't just make that statement because there'll be people that will push back. But I want to give you a brief history on slavery. I was just amazed, I got to tell you. I mean, when you come to America and you talk to people about slavery, you can talk to black people about slavery, white people about slavery, and they'll give you all this history on slavery, and it only goes back to the 16th and the 17th century. And you're like, don't they teach you the history of slavery? Why? Ask the bloody question. Why are they only teaching you the history of slavery as far back as the 16th and the 17th century? Why are they only going that far back? Because they don't want you to go farther back than that, because then you'll actually find out the truth. But from the 16th and 17th century, we'll teach you about slavery. You've got to go further back, and you've got to understand and question, why do they do this throughout the whole of America in all the public schools? Why do they only go back as far as the 16th and the 17th century to talk about slavery? We've got to go further back than that. Because Islam designed infernal slavery, and then the Ashkenazi Khazars, those who say they are Jews and are not, are the ones that marketed it, and the regal Negro nomads exiled from the kingdom of Judah were the main recipients of it at the hands of the indigenous black Africans. Because you've got to understand, the regal class of the house of Judah came down from Israel, and they came into the land of the black Africans. And the black Africans resented the regal class of the house of Judah in their land, because they had laws, they had customs, they had civility, and they were a regal class of Negro that came down into Africa. And later on, it was the Ashkenazi, the Islamic slave traders as well, that then worked together with the indigenous black Africans to enslave the regal house of Judah. This is what we've got to understand, but you've got to go back before the 16th century to understand the roots of it. So we're going to see as we dig into this where this slavery came from, because it was really a system that was very, very well crafted. There was Islamic masters and there were white Ashkenazi Khazar ship owners. There were the buyers and the sellers. And they're not going to fill you in on all of this, but really you've got a 4-tier system. Number one, you have the Negro nomads that were exiled from the kingdom of Judah. Number two, you had indigenous black African hunters that resented the regal Negro nomads that had come into their territory with their own customs, with their own laws that were different and would not assimilate into their tribal culture. They were their own tribe. They were the regal house of Judah. And number three, you had Islamic trappers that worked with the indigenous black Africans to trap the regal Negro house of Judah. And then you had them sell them to the Ashkenazi ship merchants, along with many Portuguese and British Ashkenazi. You see, it's just like Al-Qaeda today. Or is it ISIS? Or is it ISIL? Or is it IS? I mean, right? Let's just change the name as much as possible to throw you all off so you really don't know what's going on. Let's keep switching the identity to hide the people. Why don't we just keep renaming you? Are you Negro? Oh, no, you're not Negro. No, you're colored. No, you're not colored. You're African American. And this is what they name you. The slavers name you this. Because I know a white guy who grew up in South Africa. And he now lives in America. He is an African American, and more African American than most. Do you see how African American is a misnomer? It's a misnomer. Don't check that box. It's a title given to blacks by democratic slavers. Okay? Let's be real. They want you to check the box, just like they want the Anglo-Saxon to check the Caucasian box. It's not true. So, again, we've got the 4-tier system. Number one, we have the regal Negro nomadic class that are exiled from the kingdom of Judah. They are their own royal tribe in Africa. Then, number two, we have the native black African trackers. They're going to track them down. And number three, we have the Islamic trappers, because between 650 of the Common Era and 1900 of the Common Era, 10 to 20 million people were enslaved by the Arab slave traders. Over 20 million enslaved Africans were delivered through the Trans-Sahara route to the Islamic world. Can you get your head around that? That's not even touching the Americas. Over 80 million more blacks died at the hands of Islam en route. And number four, we have Ashkenazi Khazar Jewish ship merchants. And of course, the Portuguese and the British Ashkenazi were the main buyers. Islam and the Ashkenazi, those that say that they are Jews and are not, were the main sellers. Does that make sense? You've got to dig into this further. We have the two tiers right there. We have the Islamic trappers, and then we have the Ashkenazi ship merchants. You see, the Romans, they were globalist slavers. They were globalists then and now. They just migrated to Gaul, Ashkenazi, the sellers, and Britain, the British, of course, the buyers.
Now we're getting ready to go into the deep water, and we're going to find out how they went into captivity from Africa. Now we're going to find out. Now we're going to go into the transatlantic slave trade, and you will understand exactly that the transatlantic slave trade was actually prophesied in the Bible. And the Lord shall bring thee into Egypt again with ships, by the way whereof I spake unto thee, thou shalt see it no more again. And there ye shall be sold unto your enemies for bondmen and bondwomen, and no man shall buy you. So now this is the hot spot right here. This particular verse goes into the transatlantic slave trade. And for the people that just come into this knowledge, it's going to be hard for you to understand that he's actually talking about the transatlantic slave trade. So what we're going to do is we're going to break down these verses into pieces so you can understand that he's actually referring to slavery or the transatlantic slave trade. I am the Lord thy God, which brought thee out of the land of Egypt from the house of bondage. So basically, when God said, I'm going to bring you into Egypt again, he's actually saying, I'm going to bring you into slavery or bondage again with ships. And this time you're going with ships, packed up like sardines in a cans. By the way whereof I spake unto thee, thou shalt see it no more again. So now remember, God is saying that by the way whereof I spake unto thee, you shall not see Egypt again. So he's actually referring to when they came out of Egypt the first time through Moses. And God told them through Moses that the Egyptian that you see today, you're not going to see them forever. You're not going to see them forever. So if you consider this verse literally, so that means God is actually lying, which is not true. So God says, I'm going to bring you into slavery again. And remember, when they came out of Egypt and they went into the wilderness, they didn't need to build ships. They actually walked into the wilderness. And the Most High split the waters so they can walk across the sea. So God is actually saying, I'm going to send you into slavery again with slave ships. And that right there goes into the transatlantic slave trade. Say therefore to the people of Israel, I am the Lord, and I will bring you out from under the burden of the Egyptian, and I will deliver you from slavery to them, and I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and with great act of judgment. And Moses said unto the people, fear not, stand still and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will show to you today. For the Egyptian whom ye have seen today, ye shall see them again no more forever. So basically, God is saying that you're going to be sold unto your enemies during the transatlantic slave trade by the way of ships. You're going to be going into captivity, into slavery by the way of ships, and you're going to be sold unto your enemies for bondmen and bondwomen, and no man shall buy you. And remember, back in the biblical days, you would be able to buy or redeem a slave by payment. But this time, God says nobody's going to be able to redeem you out of this slavery. Nobody's going to be able to redeem you out of this slavery because you are still breaking the law of the covenant. That's why you're going to be sold unto your enemies for slave men and slave women. This is the transatlantic slave trade. The transatlantic slave trade was prophesied in the Bible long ago.
So this is how our people were further scattered into all nations, eventually losing their Hebrew-Israelite identity. So this is to show you that here in Africa, we were still identified as Hebrews. But eventually, as we were sold to Arabia, everything changed. As we were sold to the West, everything changed. As we get here, your names were stripped off. You were called by your slave masters. You no longer identified as your original Hebrew names. You are given another names. You are Hellenized. So this is how you lost your Hebrew Israelite identity. Here in Africa, you were still a Hebrew. Wherever you were taken from, you were a Hebrew. So these people hid your identity. That's why in history, even here in South Africa, about the slave trade, the history about black people in America, it only starts with slavery. Before slavery, we are not told what was happening. It only starts with slavery, the history of black people in America. It only starts with slavery. So it's very painful. So this is how you ended up where you are. You understand? This is how you went from a Hebrew to a Negro. So you are not just a Negro, you are not a Negro, a Hebrew. You are given the title Negro or Black American or a Black Brazilian or a Black European or a Jamaican, so to speak, because you are a Hebrew. They were hiding your identity. The same way here in South Africa, they told us that we are just Africans. I'm South African. That it ends there. So we have to praise the Most High for showing us this thing